Hi, my name's Kirsty Page. A few weeks ago, I did some language enrichment training for Yeat English Hub. And at the request of some of the people who attended that training, I've decided to record the session and put it out into the public domain. And the session that I'm going to record today is about language enrichment, interactions and language enrichment. To start off with, maybe I should just explain that my background initially is in speech and language therapy. And then I went on to train and work as a teacher. So hopefully what I'm going to do today is to talk about language with some of that understanding that I got from my background of being a speech and language therapist, but look at how I would consider using that understanding as a practitioner so that we can support children who have got speech and language needs and skill gaps. Language enrichment is a recognised term now. We're looking for language enrichment in child-initiated provision, and it's recognised by Ofsted and is highlighted in the new Ofsted framework, which is absolutely fantastic. Because for those of you who are early years through and through, we know and we understand that language enrichment and our interactions are really at the core of our early years practice. It's one of the biggest tools that I have in my toolbox as a practitioner. So to have it recognised is fabulous. However, language enrichment and things like having a language rich environment, they are very, very broad terms. And actually, skillful language enrichment that can be adapted to meet the needs of different children, is a very, very skillful process. And hopefully that's what I am going to unpick today. Some people, some heads have asked me in the past, oh, quality interactions, quality language enrichment, Kirsty. What should it look like? What should it sound like? And I always think, well, that's not a simple question that can be given a simple answer, because what it should look like, the first question you should ask is, well, who is the practitioner speaking with? What is the child like? What are the child skills like? Because I will want to change my interaction, the amount of language that I use, depending on the child I am interacting with. And it's this level of understanding, it's this level of skill that we're needing to have, and not see this as simplistically. So hopefully that's what I'm going to do today, to unpick it, to realize that this is a core part of our practice, but that actually to do it skillfully is quite complex and requires that understanding. But also, hopefully, by the end of the session, what I'm hopefully also going to do is get you to realize that your interactions and your language enrichment is one of the biggest vehicles that you have for moving children's skills on. And it's certainly one of the biggest vehicles you have for embedding interventions into your daily practice. The first thing that we need to consider when we're thinking about language enrichment is the term language enrichment is all about me as an adult. What words, what sentences am I using? What vocabulary am I building? But it presupposes that a child's communication skills are in place first. And if communication, two-way communication isn't in place, as a practitioner, that has to be my focus first. So a really useful thing to do is to look at the group of children, to look at the cohort of children that you are working with. And even before you begin to look at the detail of their language, ask yourself the question for each child, who is communicating? For those of you who do use Launchpad, this is about asking questions about who tunes into faces, who tunes into voices, who is demonstrating two-way, an understanding of the two-way process of communication, who's using social referencing, who's demonstrating turn taking, who's seeking you out to want to show you things and wanting to tell you things, as well as who's responding to your interactions themselves. And that doesn't always mean which of your children are talking and which of your children are not. Some of our children will have strong communication skills, but will be communicating primarily through non-verbal communication, but at least they've got communication skills in place. If we look at people who work with in a 2+ cohort, for example, and many of our schools now have 2-year provisions, and people working with PVIs, of course, will be working with 2-year-olds. Then often, if you ask that question about a small cohort of 2-year-olds, then often you can get a 50%, 50-50 split, that 50% of your children have got communication established, and 50% of your children, that will be what you need to target first. As we move up to 3+ and 4+ provisions, we can find that the numbers of children who still need us to focus on communication thankfully gets smaller, because their skills are moving on, they're becoming older, they've had more exposure often to early years education. But we still will have a core group of children, or one child maybe with more significant needs, where this has got to be where we go first. A colleague of mine who I've worked with on and off for many, many years, a fabulous lady called Claire Nicholson, who's head teacher at Pennywell Early Years Centre, she once said to me, quality teaching is all about quality interactions. And it is very difficult to teach. It's very difficult to expand language. It's very difficult to move learning on if we don't have communication established first. So that's got to be our first port of call. Once you've identified those children where, of course, you're wanting to move their language on, but your focus, your primary focus, is to establish communication, how do we go about it? What do we do? Well, the good news is that they are really simple strategies that can be embedded into your interactions, be they daily routines or be they in child-initiated learning. And before I think about what I'm going to say, the first thing that I need to do when I'm focusing on communication is to consider my positioning. So if we backtrack and look at how we instinctively interact with children when they are babies, we will often see high quality interactions are underpinned by the adult being face to face with the child. So we'll position ourselves opposite children, we will hold them so that we can have lots of face to face experiences. We'll make the most of feeding times and changing times where we've got that lovely face to face interaction. And in that first year of life, the adult's role is, of course, highly important. And we're working towards building language. But those very early interactions are all about tuning the child into me, into my face, into my voice, and to begin to instill this understanding of communication as a two-way process. We're talking about older children now, obviously, but actually, even though the child is older, these are the skill steps that they still need to be put in place. So I can no longer walk around holding the child so that I can be face to face. So I have to think about my positioning. If we take an example of a child exploring resources in the water tray, for want of a better area, this could apply to any area or any positioning inside or outside, then when I go over to target that child, to do some work to embed interventions into that experience, my instinct probably would be to go and position myself next to that child so that we can be side by side and explore those resources together. Actually, a much more beneficial thing to do would be to go to the opposite side of the water tray. And as long as your knees can cope with it, to get down and to be on that child's level so that you are having that kind of opposite face-to-face experience. So always be thinking about visual closeness rather than physical closeness, so that you are really in that child's line of sight. But also you are filtering out lots of other possible distractions by being opposite them. Where possible, if you're using resources and talking about resources, if the resources are small, obviously you can't do it with really big chunky things, but if resources are small, as you talk about resources, and we'll talk about adding language in a moment, we want to be holding things up so that they're next to our face as we interact. However, before I hold objects up to my face or say anything about them, I actually want to stop, wait, watch and listen. So before I jump in and start adding language and offering a language rich environment, it's really important that I don't jump in with 2 feet and just start adding language. What I'm wanting to do is I'm wanting to have a look at, what is the child doing? What is the child interested in? What is the child most likely thinking about at this moment in time? And what I'm waiting for them to do is to look at what they're touching and what they're moving, or if they reach for something, or if they do something and then look at me. What is it that they're doing? And what I'm wanting to do, by finding out what they're thinking about, I'm going to make sure that when I do add language, that this communication, this interaction is going to be underpinned by something called a joint point of reference. As in, what I say and what I've got in my head matches what the child's got in their head and what they're thinking about. And all communication has to be underpinned by this joint point of reference. And that's really important. And when I'm establishing communication, when the child possibly isn't offering language and talking to me to tell me about what they're thinking about, the only place I have to go, or can go, is to use their non-verbal signals, that their exploration of the resources and what they're doing, for me to work that out. If I don't do that, if I reach for another resource because I think it's interesting and I think it provides lots of language enrichment and learning opportunities, and add some fabulous language about that other resource, then, for want of a better phrase, all of that language enrichment that I have offered has been redundant, and it will have gone over the top of the child's head because it's not what they're thinking about right now. My words, my language need to match that. That's really important. When I do add language, I definitely, if this is my focus, want to be just making a very, very simple comment, a statement. At this point, my interactions shouldn't be peppered with questions. Questions require a verbal response, and they very much put the child on the spot. Here, I really want to be waiting for the child to do something and then saying something about that, adding some language. And I very, very much want to keep my language simple, very, very simple. And I either just say a very short phrase just once, or if I am going to say, have some repetition, then I say a short phrase, leave a gap, and then say that same short phrase again. What I don't want to be doing is saying lots and lots of different things. Repetition is really important in these early stages of language development. So if you are going to say something more than once, use the value of repetition. And I also want to be using exaggerated facial expression and lots of wows, and because I'm looking at making my voice, and I'm looking at using my non-verbal communication to make myself more interesting, to supplement what I am saying, to encourage the child to tune into that message. Once I've added language, though, once I've had my turn, I then go back to that process of stop, wait, watch, and listen. I don't want to keep talking. What I'm looking at trying to do is to leave a gap and watch again for what the child is doing, what the child is using, what the child is moving. Because what I'm trying to do is instill not just a joint point of reference where we're thinking about the same thing and I'm talking about what the child is thinking about, but I'm also trying to instill a pattern of turn taking, a pattern of two-way communication. If I talk and then keep talking, that means that I'm over having my turn. So I'm waiting for the child to do something, say something, then stop, wait for the child to do something else. That's their turn. Then I will say something else as well. That's really, really important. And that's where terms like language enrichment and a language-rich environment can be misconstrued. They can be interpreted as just adding language and adding lots of language, and language enrichment can, if you're not careful, become language bombardment and overuse of language. Here, my priority is that we are communicating. And without that communication, then the language enrichment that I'm offering has less value for sure. I can use the principles of leaving gaps when I share other experiences. So chances are the children who need to have a focus on communication will find group sharing of songs and rhymes quite difficult. But I can use songs and rhymes in one-to-one. That's really, really valuable. And a great kind of strategy to use is to embed those familiar songs and rhymes with gaps. And we would do this instinctively with a much younger child because it is important to putting early skill steps in place. But what I need to do is use those same principles even though the child is older. So it might be that we've got a familiar interaction rhyme, round and round the garden, for example. And what I wanted to be doing is round and round the garden, one step, two step, leave that gap, so that I don't automatically finish that rhyme. I leave a gap, and what I'm looking for is I'm looking for the child to know what's coming next, to send out a signal, to say that they want more, to say that they want that rhyme to finish. And eventually, obviously, I would hopefully be looking for them to join in and adding words, but it might be to begin with that those signals that they send out once I've left that gap are non-verbal. A really simple kind of trick, I suppose. If you're wanting to embed interventions and to target communication, is for you and your team to walk around constantly with a little wand of bubbles in your pockets, because bubbles, all children love bubbles, but they are really useful for just drip feeding in little shots of intervention when you're outside or when you're taking a child to do a little shot of intervention whilst maybe some of the other children are doing something else. It's really important that I have these strategies to embed interventions and to just drop feed it. The children that we're talking about now, they will not fit in to our intervention programs such as Early Talk Boost or Nelly, for example. You know, group sitting and listening, group learning is not what these children are ready for. So I've got to find ways to drop these interventions in, and also as well to drop them in for very short periods of time and then leave it and then come back and have another shot of intervention. You know, we're not ready for a big 15-20 minute session. That's not going to be the way that these children will work the best. So if you're using bubbles, then if I were using bubbles with children where communication and language was established, what I would be doing would be blowing the bubbles. The children would be laughing, popping them, and I would be talking and the children would be talking at the same time. So the bubbles would keep going, but the interaction would kind of be interspersed and happening at the same time. When I'm using bubbles for communication work, I'm actually trying to get some communication going, and the bubbles are just a vehicle for doing that. So what I would do is I would blow a few bubbles, hook the child into the activity, but then I wouldn't keep blowing the bubbles. I would put the wand back into the bottle and I would sit and I would wait and I would look expectantly at the child. And what I'm basically doing is I'm trying to get the child to send me out a signal, to communicate with me, to take a turn so that I can then have another turn of blowing more bubbles. And it might be that they reach for my hand to grab the bottle of bubbles. So you have to hold on tight. Or it might be that they look to the bubbles and look to me. So for those of you who use Launchpad, that's an example of social referencing. It might be that they make a noise to indicate that they want more bubbles. So of course, whether it's a grab, whether it's a look, whether it's a noise, I'm going to accept that as their turn, and I'm going to accept that as an indication that they want more bubbles. But just before I do blow more bubbles, I model what that turn could be. So if the child is communicating non-verbally, be it a noise or be it a movement or be it a look, I would model back more, 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 and then I would blow a few more. Again, notice I didn't just say more once, I said more 3 times or 2 times if you want to just say it twice, because repetition is really valuable. And then I blow a few bubbles, but then I go back to that same pattern. I've blown a few, I'm going to put my one back in and I'm going to wait expectantly. Come on, send me another turn. So what I'm doing is I'm using the gap to create an opportunity for the child to send out a signal, to have a turn. Then I am having a turn, but I am also modeling, this is how we could move that turn on. This is how we could model language to show you your next step. And later on, if a child was saying more, because they've got that word and it's become a really useful word, then before I blow the bubbles, I now say, more bubbles, more bubbles. So I'm always using my turn to model the next step. And at that point, the next step would be a 2-word phrase. Another thing that I can do, as well as walking around with my wand of bubbles in my pocket, is I can think about embedding turn taking into my environment and into my provision. And you all will have lots of opportunities there already. For those of you who use Launchpad, I am now talking about the child taking turns with a simple resource on a one-to-one with an adult. So the first thing to do is possibly to do a turn-taking audit. What have you got in your environment that would lend itself really well to little routines where it's like, my turn, your turn, my turn, your turn. So some examples could be wooden bricks so that you can take it in turns to build a tower together. What else could we use? You could have commercially available resources. So you could have things like a click clack track car, that's very difficult to say, where you've got the wooden ramp and you've got a car that rolls down. Cause and effect toys, where you would do my turn and then your turn, my turn, your turn. So cause and effect resources are really useful. So things like the Galt pop-up men, they're very useful for taking turns with. But rather than just having them in a basket or box that I have for my intervention time, I might want to still keep a special basket or box to do some focused communication work, but ultimately I want to look at opportunities that I've got in my environment and embed some of those resources into my environment as well. We could take turns to pour water through a water wheel, or one thing that I always used to use was we had some cut off bits of drain pipe outside and we would take it in turns, some days to roll balls down, some days to roll trains down, some days to roll pine cones down. It's up to you, but do an audit of what you've already got, and think about, do you want to create more opportunities? By creating that audit or carrying out that audit, what it's very useful for is to say, where are the opportunities to offer these shots of turn-taking intervention, and who are my target children? So as a team, we're very aware of where the opportunities are, who are my target children, so that we can make the most of those opportunities throughout the day. What's really good about that audit as well, though, is that those very same opportunities for my target communication children, we're looking at one-to-one turn taking initially. But I will also, chances are, have children in my setting who have got communication. But when it comes to group skills, when it comes to taking turns, sitting and listening and taking turns on the carpet or during focus activities, their group skills have not yet been facilitated to the level that is needed to learn in that way. If I've got those turn-taking opportunities identified, for those children, I can use the very same resources, the very same opportunities, but to do little drop-ins of small group interventions, but within child initiated. So at this point, we're going to take turns with the drain pipe and rolling the trains down. But this time I'm going to have 3 or 4 children playing this game with me rather than just one-to-one. And very much that's what I want as a practitioner. I want to have things that I've already got and things that I can also use in different ways to target different children. And so for those of you who do use Launchpad, that's about taking turns, but in a small group. If you've got children who struggle to sit and listen and take turns, what you don't want to do is fall into the trap of only ever working on turn taking and group skills on the carpet. What are you doing in child initiated? What are you doing throughout your environment to instill those in a much more hands-on, active way, and hopefully building skills that the children can transfer to the carpet, but not always only ever focusing on those skills in adult-led sitting and listening activities. The very same resources can also be really good for it's bread and butter sort of advice from a speech and language therapist for playing ready, steady, go. And this is really good for communication children, but it's also particularly good for children who need some work on attention and listening and waiting. So again, ready, steady, go is a strategy, I suppose, but it's something that I can use at different levels, either to encourage communication or with children who are a bit further on to build waiting and listening. And I'll try and describe that kind of briefly here. So I'm thinking about Ready, Steady, Go, a girl who I worked with who went on to be diagnosed with autistic spectrum. This girl she would use words. So she would go into the number area and pick up numbers, and she would be going 4, 2, 6, and oh my goodness, she's naming them correctly. And she really liked numbers and had a higher level of visual skill. But what was interesting was she was throwing these words out into the ether. She wasn't looking to me to tell me, oh, look, this is a number 6. She was just saying it to herself. There was no communicative intent there as she used words. So we knew she could talk. We knew the kind of the mechanics were there, but it was the communication that was tricky. And so when we played Ready, Steady, Go lots, and we did a lot of work with parents so that they did Ready, Steady, Go at home. Ready, Steady, Go and beginning to say go was the first time that girl began to use words for the purpose of communication, using a word to have an impact on another person. And so that was a fabulous kind of experience to be involved in. And when you're playing Ready, Steady, Go for communication, you can use things like the drain pipe. You can use those very, very same turn-taking resources. You can use the click-clack track car, or you can use other daily routines or an experience such as I'm standing next to the slide, but before you go down the slide today, you have to wait for me to say go. And if you were playing Ready, Steady, Go at its simplest level for communication, if it was the drain pipe, for example, I would put my hand over the end of the drain pipe and I would say, ready, steady, go. And I would then remove my hand to allow the train or whatever to be rolled down. If it was at the slide, I would be gently putting my hand on the child's leg and I would be saying, ready, steady, go, and then releasing my hand. So to begin with, you're really just instilling the routine. But the idea is that after that routine is instilled, you begin to leave that gap that we've talked about before. So you would say, ready, steady, and you're encouraging the child to send out a signal to ideally to say go, but to show you that they want to turn go. So that's how you would use it to kind of instill kind of a semblance of beginning to communicate and sending out more purposeful messages. To use it though more to kind of just more generally with children to build listening and attention. Ideally you get to the point where you don't have to put your hand on their leg or put the hand over the end of the drain pipe, and then you're saying things like ready, steady, go, and then gradually increasing the length of that gap. So ready, steady, go, and then ready, steady. You can't leave it too long, but what you're looking at is you're looking at gradually stretching that ability to wait and to listen. And the good thing about this is I am embedding a little shot of work on listening and attention into an activity that wouldn't normally be seen as an auditory or a listening activity. But because of the way that I'm using the resource, I'm turning it into a chance to work on those skills. When children get to the point where they can cope with ready, steady, relatively long gap, go, you can begin to play with language. So you can begin to use this very same activity to work on listening for meaning. And at this point, it starts to get quite funny. So you might say, ready, steady, stop, or ready, steady, bananas. And you're looking at the child, having to wait, having to listen, but then to consider, what did she say? Did she say go? No, she didn't. She said stop. And that's kind of just a really simple game to embed, but really quite useful. And it's interesting how many children who struggle to move on to that next level, who will go down the slide or put something down the drain pipe when you say a word, no matter what that word is. And I suppose the final level of that kind of game, that might be a bit further on in the year, or it might be this level that I play quite quickly with a certain child because their skills are at a higher level. I might say things like ready, steady, bow, ready, steady, goat. And here what I'm doing is, again, the word is different and it means something different. So it's still listening for meaning, but I am deliberately choosing a word that sounds like go. It has a similar phonological structure. And by doing so, as well as working on listening for meaning, I'm also beginning to hone in on those auditory discrimination skills where I have to listen really closely to the structure of a word. And it might be that at the same time, I've got lots of children having a turn on the slide and I'm moving up and down that hierarchy of ready, steady, go because of my knowledge and understanding of the children who are sitting at the top of the slide each time, and also my understanding of what their skills are like and where I might need to go with that child next. So through all of this, the more I understand about my children and about child development, the more productive my interactions and drop-in interventions can become. I've already mentioned this notion of leaving gaps when you are sharing songs and rhymes, and I think it's really important that we flip the notion of what intervention is, particularly in the early years when we have so many opportunities to work on these skills. That yes, of course, you can run an intervention program where you deliver certain activities to a small group of children, however many times a week. We've already said that a lot of our children with communication needs won't fit into that format. The skills that they need targeting will be much, much further back in terms of development, but also the format of group learning, group listening, group talking is not what they are ready for yet. But even if you do deliver intervention programs, you should always only ever see it as one part of your toolbox. And actually, by embedding interventions, I create many more opportunities, and interventions actually are just targeted practice. So when it comes to songs and rhymes, if children are struggling to do group singing, group sharing, consider how can you create opportunities to share songs and rhymes in that kind of leaving gap way, that very interactive way, and on a one-to-one, because that's how children would learn to share songs and rhymes first, in the same way as we would share them with younger children. Also, as well, think about how you can use books. Again, group story listening, answering questions about stories will be problematic for many of the children we're considering here. Even going and accessing books independently might not be something that they particularly do. How can I be more inclusive? And certainly if you're getting ready for Ofsted, how can you create a love of reading for all? And that's about thinking about how you share books with that child and what books you might use. So to be inclusive, a really kind of useful tip is just to make sure that you still have some card books, as in where the pages are made of card rather than paper, and you still have books with hard copies, not always the floppy laminated covers, because many of our children who don't go and access books independently, it might be that they struggle to turn pages independently because of fine motor skills. And again, children need to build that resilience and perseverance. But actually, if it's really, really difficult for me, then often what we find is children will just opt out of that activity. So think about the motor demands of the books, and can you be more inclusive by making sure that you've got some there that would be easier to hold, easier to manipulate and turn pages. When we're thinking about using books for communication, it's really useful to think, well, of course, books are a vehicle for building language and stories, but actually, I've got to get an interaction going with this book first. And my go-to would always be to make sure that I have lots of touchy-feely books, and probably the ones that everybody knows are the Usborne collection of That's Not My Car, or That's Not My Dolly, or That's Not My Monster, where we've got lots of different textures and sheens within that book. So that, okay, yes, we've got that ability to build language and very repetitive text, and that ability to build concept vocabulary. But most importantly, because the book is multisensory, it's half book, half resource. And so by using those books, as well as building those multisensory experiences, it's much easier to build an interaction. Other useful books are lift the flat books, so we can play almost like peekaboo, but with whether it be Spot or something else. Where is he? There he is. And those lift the flat, where there's something to do, but where we can have those repetitive kind of interactions that we might also play ourselves. Where is he? There he is. Are really, really useful. And also books with movable parts. So again, there's something to do. So really, really see your books as part of your intervention toolkit, but you have to kind of think about how you share them and what you share. And often a lot of this is about kind of tracking back to those principles that we use with younger children. And we use those principles with younger children because they are really good experiences for putting certain skill steps in place. This child might be older, but actually those are the skill steps that that child still needs to have put in place. The other thing that is useful to consider is to just look at your daily routines. Daily routines are such a rich kind of picking ground for embedding interventions, but also to think about, how do you and your team use language within those daily routines? Is there that kind of level of familiarity, that level of repetition? And if we look to kind of families, for example, who are very successful at facilitating language with children, we often can find that their family routines are spattered with little mantras, little family language routines. So maybe, for example, when one adult helps the child or puts the baby's coat on, and then later on helps as they're getting older, that through that early life that there is a little routine. So it might be one arm in, two arms in, whatever it is, but it's very simple and it's very repetitive. And what you find is that chances are other adults who are involved and care for that child will begin to follow that same routine. So everybody's not following a script, or everybody's not sounding like robots and copies of one another, but the family life is spattered with those little familiar mantras. And by having that repetition, by having that familiarity, it breeds understanding, and but also once the child is ready, it increases the chances that the child will have a go at joining in, adding the first odd word and then saying the whole mantra themselves as they get older. And all I'm saying in your early years environments is, how do you say certain things when you're helping target children to turn on the taps and wash their hands? How do you what do you say when you're pouring and giving out the milk, or when you're helping with the coats? And how do you say it? And when you're not there, when somebody else is there, do they say the same thing or a similar thing, or do they say something completely different? And I just think it's really useful to talk as a team about that familiar routines. We know that having routines is really important, but what is the language that goes with it? And the earlier the language development level, the more important that becomes. So I'll leave that one with you to consider. Now, what we've talked about now is, so far, is we've talked about communication with a little bit of listening and a little bit of group work kind of thrown in, but our main focus has been on communication. What I then need to think about is, well, if communication is in place, what things do I need to consider when it comes to language enrichment and building language skills? The first thing that I will say is, a lot of those principles that we've talked about for communication still stand true when you are working with children with lower levels of language and listening skills. So say, for example, if I've got a child whose communication is established, but actually when it comes to interaction, they're very distractible and they find it very difficult to focus on me or what they're doing, because, let's remember, I'm probably in a very, very busy early years environment. Then simple principles like still going and positioning myself opposite that child will really benefit that interaction. So again, I'm not thinking getting the basics of interaction, of communication in place with this child, but I am positioning myself opposite that child still to say, here I am in a position where I'm the main signal kind of coming into you, and because I'm opposite you, there's less likelihood of you being distracted by other things in the environment. So by positioning myself in that way, I am building your attention and I'm helping you to focus on me and what we're talking about. When I am adding language, when we talked about children with communication, we talked about saying a very, very simple phrase. And if you were going to say more than one thing, just to use repetition. Because chances are children where I'm focusing on communication, their receptive language, their understanding of language will be at a very early level as well. So by keeping language simple, I am making it more likely that the child will be able to process the language that I'm using to learn new vocabulary, but that vocabulary is not housed within a longer sentence, it's housed within a very, very short phrase, because the language processing will need to be achievable for that child. So one of the biggest things that I need to think about when it comes to language enrichment is my language load. How much should I say to different children? We will probably all have heard the term simplify your language when it comes to supporting children with language and communication needs. But the big question is, well, how much? If I am thinking about certain children and I simplify my language, so I only ever use short phrases with one main information carrying word or keyword, whichever one you want to call it, but the child actually has got the ability to maybe understand at a 2-word level, and their next step would be to begin to understand at a 3-word level. If I simplify my language too much, I'm going to have a successful interaction. They're going to be able to process the language that I am using. But because I've gone too far back, what I'm not doing is building their capacity to begin to hold more words and hold more language within their language processing. However, if I go the opposite way, if I begin to use really quite longer sentences, then a lot of my language will be going over the top of that child's head because I've bombarded them. I've added too much language for their system to process. So this is kind of really important. So if you have children who are seen by speech and language therapists and have assessments, and they're saying that this child is understanding at a 2-word level, then of course that information is useful to think about what little activities you might want to carry out with that child in order to build that skill. But the most fundamental thing to consider with that information is, what does that mean to me? What does it mean to me and my team and our interactions, and the amount of language that we should be adding to different children? It's very, very crucial. So for those of you who use Launchpad, this kind of understanding is all plotted out in the auditory memory for understanding column, which of course has huge implications for children's ability to follow instructions, understand and hold language in stories, to hold a sentence, and to underpin blending. That's one of the things that we often don't consider. But actually, by measuring where different children are in that column is really useful to reflect on and to think about, right, okay, well, what does that mean to the language that we add, and how much language we use to simplify where needed, but not to oversimplify, so that I have this really inclusive approach, but I'm also making sure that my target is progression as well, for sure. Once I've considered kind of just generally my language load, I also want to be considering something called targeted language enrichment. So as well as focusing on interactions and not simplifying too much, but also not using language that's too complex, what are the skills that this child in particular needs to develop? What are the things that I'm needing to target, that I'm needing to model? And even children who don't have skill gaps, this child has just turned 3, their language is pretty much where it should be, but what are the skills that they need to learn through this year to move their language on? So this notion of targeted language enrichment is important for all children, but targeted language enrichment really comes into its own when you're thinking about children with skill gaps and ways of meeting their next steps. And by considering targeted language enrichment, it increases the productivity of my interactions, and it means that the gap filling process, or the gap narrowing process, is embedded into every time I interact and talk to a child. So again, we're moving away from this notion that intervention has to be an activity and that intervention has to be something separate. Actually, intervention is embedded into my practice and embedded into every single interaction that I have. Then when I am using targeted language enrichment, of course, there will be times when I need to, and I want to ask questions. Children need to learn how to understand and respond to questions. But I think as practitioners, we probably ask more than enough questions anyway. And what I really want to kind of just add in here is that when it comes to targeted language enrichment, comments will always be far more productive than questioning. If we think about questioning is where I take a verbal turn, but then really what I'm doing is I am demanding another verbal turn from the child I am asking the question to. So there is that notion of by asking a question, I am putting a child on the spot, and I am demanding talk. And for some children, that can be really non-productive because they don't function as well. They don't like being put on the spot. The other thing about questioning is I ask a question to encourage children to use certain items of vocabulary and to hear certain sentence structures. So I'm presuming when I ask a question that my children know those words, that vocabulary is already stored. And I'm presuming that the children have got the capability to form those types of sentences. And with many of our children, that's not the case. So I'm asking a question to try and hear that. But the reality is, I'm trying to hear something that actually the child hasn't got stored yet. So commentary, that kind of focus on adding language, it is the most productive because it's about storing language, modeling sentence structures. And certainly a friend of mine, a lady who I trained with, a fabulous lady called Lynn Jones, who now works as a therapist in Gateshead Authority, she always used to talk to me about be a word feeder, not a word retriever. And I use that kind of mantra to this day. I think it's a really kind of productive one to think about. And the catch-22 is the more I move away from questioning, the more I make comments and have more natural two-way communications with my children, the more my children will actually talk. So sometimes as a practitioner, I feel I have to ask questions to generate talk, whereas the catch-22 is the less I question, the more I comment, the more talk will actually be generated. And there's lots of research out there. And certainly if you're interested in these principles or some of these things I'm talking about, it might be worth looking into Hanen, www.hanen.org. It's a Canadian organization, and they have some fantastic principles to talk about these things, and have done a lot of research on these things too. A really simple but easy win is also to really shift your focus onto verb vocabulary. So if you are thinking about your learning environment, as a team, look at your learning environment. What are the verb opportunities that your home corner creates? What are the verb opportunities that your water exploration and play creates? What verbs does having Play-Doh out? What verb opportunities are there? And by kind of talking about your areas in that way, it really just encourages you, as you add language, to make it more likely that you will begin to do more adding of verbs and describing activity. I think as practitioners, our instinct is to describe things, to talk about what things are like, what they look like, what they feel like, what they sound like. And of course, that's still very, very valuable. But what we often forget to do enough of is to describe activity. What are we doing? What is happening? And verbs can be the poor relation of our language enrichment and our adding of vocabulary, which is a shame because actually verbs have a really important role. They are really important for building sentences. So when you build sentences, the verb is kind of like the most important word. And what we find is that children who don't have verbs in their early vocabulary often will struggle to move into forming sentences. So they'll be stuck at single word use or only using two-word phrases. And when you look at it, it's like, well, it's very difficult for them to move into sentence formation because they haven't got the verbs that they need. So verbs are really, really important. When you're thinking about adding verbs, make sure that you add them in the moment of the activity, but ideally add them just before the activity and just after. So I don't know, if we were going outside, for example, because we were looking for leaves, or I don't know, we were looking for snails in the garden, or whatever it might be, I would say we're going to look, and then as we are looking, we're looking, and then afterwards I would say, oh, we looked. So that when I am using a verb, I'm not talking about using it 15 minutes before and 15 minutes after. I'm talking about still within the moment of the activity, but I'm allowing the child to hear that verb in the future tense, to hear that verb in the present tense, and then straight away to hear it in the past tense. That's really important. Now, with a verb like look, it's quite a simple grammatical verb because it's a regular verb. I looked, so if you were spelling it, you would just add ed. But many of the verbs that we use in our daily life and in our early years environment are what you would call irregular verbs. So eat, for example, to build, to make, to write, to draw, so that, oh, I'm going to draw a person. I'm drawing a person. I'm drawing some hair. Oh, I drew a person. So drew rather than drawed. And so by making sure that we use the verbs in the different tenses, of course, it's about increasing the likelihood that as children get older, that they say drew instead of drawed, and that they say ran instead of runned, which again is quite normal in language development, but at some point we want to be using those irregular past tenses. But actually it's fundamentally important because the child needs to first and foremost understand that verb in all of its grammatical forms, so that drew is reflected and is related in meaning to draw. And that's just about being able to understand conversations, but it's also about being able to understand stories. Most stories, in fact, nearly all stories are written in the past tense. So if when we're playing with the transport and I'm going to fly the aeroplane, oh, it flew all the way over here, then when I'm reading Room on the Broom later on in the day, and away the witch flew, then they are relating that verb to the verb to fly. So again, it's quite crucial that I model the grammatical structures that I want my children later on to use, but first and foremost, I want them to understand. In the same way, when I am modeling verbs, sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes I want to make sure that I model the small verbs. When I'm normally talking in spoken language, I will collapse verbs down. So if we were in the sand and we were digging, then I would say, I'm digging, you're digging, he's digging, she's digging, they're digging. So the verb is collapsed with the pronoun. However, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes I want to make a point of saying, I am digging, you are digging, he is digging, they are digging, because I need the children sometimes to hear that so that they understand that they are actually two separate words. They're not the same word. And if we look in schools, we can often find children in Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2 even, who think that your, as in the possessive, your hat, is the same as your, as in you're digging, you apostrophe re, because they don't actually understand. It's not just a spelling issue, they actually haven't understood that those are separate grammatical forms. So that is not a deal breaker for your early years practice. It's not going to affect whether your children get a good level of development at the end of the early years. But it will, little things like this will have an impact on children's capability in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. So often in schools who are Launchpad users, we often look to the older children to look at the issues that we have, and then we track that back into our practice in the early years. We don't track the formality, or we don't bring the learning earlier, but what we do is we unpick that and we say, what can we do in the early years to make it less likely that by the time these children right now in early years right now get to Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, that will be less of an issue for less of our children, if that makes sense. And the last thing that I want to say about verbs, I could talk about verbs all day. Some people have joked that when I eventually pop my clogs, that on my gravestone it will say, "Here lies Kirsty Page, who said verbs are really important," by the way, because I do talk about verbs quite a lot, but they are really important. So the other thing is about making sure that you have an inclusive but also a progressive approach to verbs. So let's go back to that case scenario of looking for leaves or looking for mini beasts or whatever it is that you are looking for. That for some children, I were talking about looking and finding and putting the leaves in the basket, so that when I'm using verbs, I'm deliberately using quite basic verbs, the most obvious verbs to describe the process of what we're doing: to look, to find, to put. And that would be the same in any activity or any daily routine that I will be sharing. My focus is on to build the very basic building blocks of language. However, for many of my children, they'll know looking and they'll know finding and they'll know putting. So I am not saying don't ever use those words once children know them, but I want to move my language enrichment on so that I want to be talking about searching and exploring and discovering and uncovering. Does that kind of make sense? So that once those basic building blocks of vocabulary, I am being progressive. So I'm saying, right, how else could we say that? What's a more specific or a slightly less familiar way of saying the same thing? In the same way as if I'm interacting with children and the child has got something to say, that, you know, when the child is young, then probably I'll just use the verb to tell. But as children kind of move on, you know, if my nursery teacher is saying, "Oh, tell me," and I'm in reception always still only ever using the verb to tell, I need to be looking at that and thinking about the progressive element to my language. So if I am in reception and I've got a child who still needs work on really basic language skills, then fine. But if my children already know that verb, then I need to be increasingly saying, "Can you describe for me? Can you explain? Can you instruct your partner?" So that I don't want my language enrichment to become to not move on, because if I'm wanting the children to move on, then my language has to move on as well, but to go back to the basics where I need to with certain specific children. Within targeted language enrichment, we've talked about that general focus on verbs because of their value in describing activity. And the other reason verbs are particularly important is that the main reason children want to talk is to tell you about what they're doing, and later on to tell you about what they're going to do or what they've done before. So verb vocabulary is a really powerful group of words to give children, because it's actually giving them the tools to say what they want to say. However, from a more kind of specific learning point of view, we will know that certain vocabulary will be really important to put foundations in for learning. And I think if we look to maths, generally in early years practice, we are probably already there with targeted language enrichment. So we know that if there is a chance to talk about the size or the shape or the position or the number of something, then instinctively myself and my team will add that language or quantity. Oh, I've got more, because we know that the understanding of these concepts will really underpin the applications in maths as they get older. But we also need to remember that concepts also have a role to play in phonic and literacy readiness. So for those of you who are Launchpad users, you will know I already talk about the importance of that positional vocabulary for children to hear sounds in words. So, where are my opportunities in my daily routines, in my learning environment, to add beginning, middle, and end? Because when we're lining up, or if I'm putting the train over the bridge, it's like, oh, the train's at the beginning of the bridge, now it's in the middle, and now it's at the end of the bridge. When I'm reading stories, for example. So, and at the beginning with this banana, I'm going to take the peel off. In the middle, I'm going to eat it. And then at the end, I'm going to put it in the bin. Because there will be many of our children who struggle to hear sounds in words, because they actually don't know that when you say what sounds at the beginning and they go meow, they actually don't know what that concept means. So targeted language enrichment is really important, not just for maths, but for phonic readiness. What's the same, what's different, what's nearly the same of other important words. And also we talked about the verb opportunities when we were putting the Play-Doh out. And if we look at that, we've got things like poke and press, but we've also got twist and pull and push. And we know that those are really important verbs for scientific understanding, for the understanding of forces. So when you are looking at how do you teach subjects in the early years that will morph into independent subjects later on in education, such as science and geography, then it is about sometimes, well, what are the activities that we specifically do to give our children scientific experiences? But it is also about, more generally, how do you build that vocabulary that will feed in to that future subject area? So think about, all vocabulary is important, but you also need to have this notion of target vocabulary, what I would call deal breaker words. If your children don't know what these words mean, it will have an impact on their ability to access later learning, be that in reception or Key Stage 1 or Key Stage 2. I think we also need to be really aware that, of course, vocabulary is important, but there's a lot more to language than just vocabulary. And that one of the things that we often don't think about enough is how we model and how we move children's grammatical skills on. We're very aware when children make grammatical errors, but do we ever make the link of thinking, right, well, how am I going to try and fix those errors and fill that gap through the way that I use language and through my interactions? We've already talked there about the tenses that are so important as we add verbs. But as you name objects, as you name things in pictures, in books, for example, so as you're adding noun vocabulary, make sure that you add names in the singular, but you also model what that would sound like in the plural as well. So this is a pen, and I've got some pens. So that children develop that ability to use plurals in their talk, but also have that understanding. And for children who are learning English as an additional language, who are new to English, that conscious modeling, not just of vocabulary, but vocabulary with different grammatical structures is crucial. Pronouns is one people notice where children have got skill gaps and immaturities with their use of pronouns. So again, it's quite normal in language development that children will say me instead of I, and then it will morph into the adult use of I, and then we'll say him instead of he, and then it becomes he. So that's part of language development. But again, we begin to notice it as children get older, but their stage of language development, their stage of grammatical use is still the same as it would have been when they were a younger child. And it's that mismatch between stage and age that makes us begin to notice things, that makes us begin to become concerned as the gap gets wider. So if you've got children with pronoun immaturities, or to be honest, even if you've got children who it's not an issue, it's just part of normal development, but at some point they're going to need to learn to use pronouns correctly, the first thing that you need to consider is, how do you use pronouns yourself? So how much do you model yourself saying I? Oh, I'm going to choose a story because I'm going to read a story, so make sure that when you are talking about what you're doing, that you're using the word I, and that you're indicating that this is me talking about me, and I am using the word I to do that. Certainly don't fall into the trap where you are calling yourself by your name. Oh, Mrs. Page is going to find a book because Mrs. Page. And certainly if we listen in cloakrooms, and if we listen to whether they be grandmas or parents, or talking to children, it can be quite common for parents to call themselves mummy, and mummy's come to pick you up, and mummy's got you some sweets, or what have you, or look at what granny's got you. Or that if we have got adults in the child's life who call themselves by their name rather than use the pronoun I, it's really important that I take an extra role of responsibility of modeling myself using the word I, and that's quite important. But also just think generally about how much do you use other pronouns as well. So it is very common, because we're working with groups of children, that we will overuse children's names, or we overuse names in other ways to clarify who we are talking about. So say, for example, we've been sharing Goldilocks. It would be quite usual if we were sequencing some pictures to do with Goldilocks, or if I had some puppets, for example, to go through the story again, then I would say, and Goldilocks went for a walk in the forest, and Goldilocks found a cottage, and Goldilocks went into, and Goldilocks, and Goldilocks, and Goldilocks, so that every time it's quite common that I would use the Goldilocks's name at the start of the sentence to clarify the subject of the sentence. However, by doing that, what I'm not doing is modeling how I would use a pronoun. So just think about that, particularly as children get, to that kind of 3+ stage, that I say, and Goldilocks went for a walk in the forest, and she found a cottage, so that I am naming. And if I've got a puppet, it's clarifying who I'm still talking about anyway, that I still am using the pronoun rather than using Goldilocks's name too often. That's so important. And that's about encouraging grammatical understanding. It's about encouraging children's ability to use that grammar as they get older, or now. But it's also an important part of reading comprehension. If we think about reading comprehension in the future, a subject is named at the start of the sentence, and then in the next few sentences, a pronoun is used to refer back to that subject. The subject's name is not used throughout the text. So it's important that in our spoken interactions, we are aware of those skills that children will need, not right now, but they'll certainly need as they begin to read a little bit more. And again, if I'm working with a group of children, if we're taking it in turns to find something in a feely bag, or whatever activity, and it's Joshua's turn, I will say, oh, Joshua, it's your turn. And then I might look to Joshua, and then I want to say, well, I wonder what you are going to find. Or if I look to the other children, I say, I wonder what he's going to find, because chances are I would say, I would look to the other children and say, I wonder what Joshua's going to find. And so again, just think about that and reflect on that. Are you modeling the skills that you need the children to move on with? Are you modeling those gaps that you need to fill? And in the same way, I suppose, I'll have some children who are using a short phrase and then they'll leave a gap and then they'll use another phrase. So what they're not doing, and again, this is kind of, we look for this in Launchpad, but for any of you who used to use the ECAT tracker, we look for children using conjunctions, linking sentences and phrases together with and, so, because. I might notice that I've got a child who's using short phrases, but they're not moving into longer sentences because they're not linking them together with those linking conjunction words. So if I become aware of that, then when I am interacting with that child, I'm going to deliberately model using those types of conjunctions myself in a very simple way. So I'm filling the jug and I'm going to tip it out. And I'm tipping it out, so that what I'm doing is I'm consciously saying that because I know that that's something that I want to hear the child begin to use at some point. So by consciously targeting that and adding that in, I increase the likelihood that the child will move on in that way. And in the same way, I want to sometimes model negative language. And by that, I don't mean by being critical, but if certainly Stephen Parsons, who does Word Aware and Concept Cat, he talks a lot about teaching one concept at a time. So he talks a lot about, oh, this is shiny, this is not shiny, and more complex grammatical way of saying that will be this isn't shiny. And so doing lots of sorting is not just good for language development, as in building that concept, or, if you were tidying up, oh, this goes in this basket because it is an animal. Oh, that does not go in that basket. This is not an animal. This isn't an animal. It goes in here. It's really important that we make deliberate opportunities for children to hear language in that way. I think we've pretty much talked about this anyway. So it's this notion of seeing your environment as creating language enrichment opportunities, or opportunities for things like turn taking, and really kind of plotting out where those opportunities are, but also where, if you need to, do you need to create more opportunities, for example? So if you were deliberately prioritizing beginning, middle, and end as a way of involving language preparation in your phonic preparation, what are the opportunities that you've got already? Actually, we might want to deliberately add a few more, just so that we've got more opportunities to build that skill. So that I increasingly see my learning environment as opportunities for learning, but also opportunities for language enrichment. And then I suppose it's being aware of those opportunities, but all of this is also underpinned by having that greater level of awareness of where your children are, understanding the process of language development, and ideally knowing where the children's gaps are, and having that incremental understanding of what you need to put in place in order to narrow and close that gap. Obviously, for Launchpad users, that's the whole idea of Launchpad: gap identification and gap closing. Or even when there are no gaps, just having that understanding of what are the things that your children need to learn, and what are the skills they need to acquire over the coming months and over the coming year. But obviously, these are things that we can consider without Launchpad as well. A lot of that is about my language enrichment, as in, what am I going to say? And obviously that's influenced by what is happening, but it's also influenced by this notion of targeted language enrichment and things that I'm trying to achieve. But of course, hopefully, a lot of the time, part of that process will be the child talking as well. And there will be some times when I want to use my turn to try and make what the child has said better in the future. And so if you think about children who use shorter sentences than you would ideally like them to, or still are using short phrases or even single words, then what I can do in my interactions is just to use the strategy of repeat back and add one. So the child offers a single word or a two-word phrase or a short sentence, whatever, and I accept that. All of these strategies are always underpinned by me accepting the child's turn. There is no kind of sense of correction or not, I really want to keep that conversation going. But what I do is I accept it, but then I use my turn to repeat back what the child has said, but I add another key piece of vocabulary on. So really what I'm doing is I'm having a turn to say, here you go, here's another word that you could add to that as well. So here's a chance possibly to learn some new vocabulary. And also here's an example of, in a few weeks' time, this is how you could begin to make your sentence or that sentence a little bit longer. So really what I'm doing is I'm using the give and take of interaction, a give and take of a conversation to try and mold that child's utterance into something better. So the child has got no sense of what I am doing, but that is obviously ultimately what I am trying to do. And repeat back and refine is a very similar strategy, but here I am not looking at repeating back and adding. I'm looking at repeating back to make what they have said a little bit better. So it might be that the child is saying, if they're drawing, for example, it might be that they say, I do my mum, as in they're drawing their mum. And so what I might do is say, oh yes, you're drawing your mum. So I use that interaction to accept it, completely accept it, but to say, here you go, here's a more specific word, here's a more specific verb that you might want to begin to use in the future. And I also will want to do that when a child makes grammatical errors, even if they're age appropriate. So it's like, we run here, we run here. Oh, you ran here, fabulous, you ran all the way. So again, I'm using my interaction to not correct, but just to model back what the next step would be. And obviously, if they're making pronoun errors as well, if they're saying, him got the red bike, then I would say, oh, he's got the red bike. So again, I'm not pulling you up, I'm not correcting, but I am modeling back the right one. And so it's quite straightforward. The only one you have to think a little bit more about is when children are using me instead of I. So if the child is saying, me got a pen, then if I say to the child, you've got a pen, I've accepted, I've acknowledged, but I haven't actually managed to model I. If I say to the child, I've got a pen, but actually I've modeled that back and I haven't got a pen, then it doesn't make sense. So the only kind of one that you have to think a little bit more laterally is that me and I. So if the child is saying me got a pen, then you've got two options. You either, if you haven't got a pen already, you quickly reach one and you say, oh yes, I have a pen as well. You have a pen, I have a pen. And again, feel free to use your non-verbal to emphasize that. Or if there's no pen to hand, then you just say, oh yes, you've got a pen. I have not got a pen. I haven't got a pen. Does that kind of make sense? Quite simple. But it's important that you discuss this as a team so that you see when you are doing these things naturally, that you value them and that you actually see that this is part of your intervention toolbox. Management of speech sound changes is like repeat back and refine, really. But if I've got a child who is saying, can you fasten my tote? So can you fasten my coat? then the main sound change that I'm probably going to want to model back is the t, k, tote for coat. So I either just say, oh yes, I can fasten your coat. So I either just repeat it back, but adding obviously the words with the right sounds, or I might even in that circumstance go, oh, your coat, your coat. Of course I can fasten your coat. Does that kind of make sense? Chances are, as a teacher, I'd probably say, oh, let's see if you can use it by yourself, but depending on the age of the child, obviously. But I'm talking about that as an interaction where I accept it, but I make sure that I repeat back those words with the sounds in the right way. It's really easy to do that when you understand and know what the child has said, but there will be times when certain children say things to you where you just think, I'm not quite clear on that. And the more children speak out of context, maybe about something that's happened outside or something that's happened at home, the more difficult it can sometimes be to understand children who have got speech sound changes, because you don't have that context, you don't have those other clues, that shared knowledge in order to work out what the message is. If you really don't understand, it's important that you have a white lie for the greater good. So it's really important that you say, oh, I don't know what that is. Can you show me? Or things like, oh, do you know what? It's really noisy in here. I can't hear very well today. Can you show me? Or can you tell me again? It's important that I don't say, I'm really sorry, I don't understand what you're saying. Even though that is the truth, I want to keep awareness as possible, as low as possible. And I want to take the blame in order to help with that, because I want that child to keep coming up to me, to keep telling me things, because it's by them telling me things and me then most of the time having the ability to accept and repeat back, that repeat back and refine, that is the way that I will help their speech to move on. We talked a lot about stop, wait, watch and listen when it came to children who we needed to instill two-way communication with. Another useful question to ask of your children who possibly are or who are communicating and who are talking is, who initiates interactions using talk? And again, in the pragmatic area of Launchpad, that's something that we're looking for. We're not just looking for children talking, we're looking for children beginning to initiate interactions with talk as well. It's a really important social communication. And you will identify for sure children who are talking, but who always, always wait, or you always end up starting the interaction off, either by asking a question or saying something first. And we need to become aware of that pattern. We need to make sure that we create the space for that child to learn how to initiate. So when initiation is a target, I need to go back to that stop, wait, watch and listen. So if I'm going to go over to an area to interact with a certain child, or if I'm already in an area and that child comes across, really bite your tongue and really wait. Give the child some space to say something first before you jump in with 2 feet. And if it looks like, hang on a minute, we're not going to say anything because you've left a reasonable length of time, then at least wait for them to do something and say something about what they've done. So they haven't initiated with talk, but at least they've initiated the interaction and the conversation with activity. That's really important. And then once children can initiate conversations with talk, a more specific skill is the ability to use language to ask. And that could be to ask for help. But it also could be using language to ask a peer. So it could be to ask to join in or to ask for a turn. So asking is a really important skill to facilitate peer interactions. And sometimes children who are on the edges and do lots of observation, it's really interesting to say, do they know how to ask to join in, to ask for a turn? Is that something that I actually need to coach them, to teach them? And it's about peer interaction, but the other reason asking questions and being able to ask for help in particular is really important is because I want children to ask me if they don't know what to do, if they can't remember. Later on when they read, I want children to ask me if they haven't understood what they have read. And that becomes a real big issue for us in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. So it's really important in the early years for peer interaction now, but for later learning, that I instill coaching and teaching children how to ask into my practice, into my provision. And the easiest way to start is obviously with asking for help. So it might be, I don't know, if a child's got a wet jumper because they've been in the water play, that some children just come to us and might hold their wet sleeves out to indicate, please, can you help me take my jumper off? But they're not saying anything. Or it might be that they come up and just say, my jumper's wet. And again, they're asking in their own way, but they're not using language to ask. They're making a statement. And I need to know that child. So for some children, I might say, so what you need to say is, help, please, help, please. And it might be that for some children, that is an achievable model. The child who's come up to me and said, my jumper's wet, I know maybe that child can speak in sentences. So for that child, I might say, okay, so what you need to say is, please, can you help me with my jumper? Because that child can speak in sentences. That sentence would not be a problem for that child, but what they don't know how to do is to form a sentence for the purpose of asking. So that's asking for help, and that is often the easiest way to start for you and your team, because it's often you, the adults, that the child is asking for help. But it's also important that I get my children to ask each other for turns or to join in. So when I'm in child initiated and I'm coaching that skill, again, I don't talk for the child. I want to model for the child what needs to be said. And that's crucial in our practice. And certainly if you look at children often who have behaviour issues, then I often talk to people about, well, let's look at their understanding of turn taking. Let's look at their understanding of language, and let's look at skills such as social communication. Do they snatch and grab because they don't understand about turn taking, but also do they snatch and grab because they don't know what to say, how to ask in a different way? So that's the end of the session. I've tried to cram in as much as possible. Here, if you do want to find out more about Launchpad for Literacy, you can go to the website, probably the best place to go. It needs a bit of a revamp, but please forgive me. Is the Find Out More page, and right down at the bottom we've got some fabulous case studies from practitioners and settings. There's a Google Drive link here that either you can write down now if you pause the screen, or if you email me, I can just send it to you, where I discuss early years practice with a fantastic lady called Anne Brass, who's from Durham Local Authority. And also I recently did a podcast about speech and language and communication, but about how that impacts on early years practice with the Early Years Foundation Stage Forum. So that is not about Launchpad, actually, that's just about general communication. So the link to that is on there as well. If you've taken anything away from this and you think other people might benefit from it too, this video is in the public domain, so feel free to share it with Tom, Dick and Harry in your networks if you feel that they would benefit too. Thank you very much.